Today marks a pivotal moment in the American journey, a moment that calls not just for political decision, but for careful reflection, for courage, and for clarity. The administration has taken a bold step with the executive order initiating the dismantling of the Department of Education. This is not merely a bureaucratic adjustment, it is a philosophical and cultural correction aimed at realigning our nation's education system with its foundational principles.
Advisor Stephen Miller, who joins me now. Stephen, great to see you. Thanks for joining us as we await this event from President Donald Trump. Let's start working through those questions, if we might, together. Why is the administration looking today to issue executive orders to dismantle the Department of Education?
Well, as we know, the Department of Education here in Washington, D.C. is overwhelmingly staffed by radical left Marxist bureaucrats who are in every way hostile to Western civilization, hostile to American interests, and hostile to our founding documents and culture. And so they are using their position and influence inside the Department of Education to try to force agendas like radical gender ideology, like critical race theory, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all kinds of anti-America curricula and policies on the American people, on our students, on our children. So it's taking away from parents the ability to control and direct the education of their own kids, of their own families. So what we're going to do under President Trump's leadership and direction is to return that authority to the greatest extent possible to the local level where parents can control outcomes, while at the same time making sure that no federal funds are used to support racism, to support gender ideology, or support other ideas and principles that are offensive to the American taxpayer.
All right, now let's talk about the how, Stephen. It would take, by most reports, an act of Congress to abolish the Department of Education. But it's expected that today, through executive orders, you can do much to dismantle the power of the DOE. So how will this affect what you just described? How will this stop what we've seen in the past from the DOE?
Yes, so we've already seen in anticipation of this action, Secretary Linda McMahon announced her plans to lay off half of the bureaucratic workforce here in Washington, D.C. Obviously, those efforts are going to be scaled up, and so a major thing the president has full and complete control over is the federal workforce. Now, you mentioned a district court judge inevitably will try to interfere in that, but the president and the president alone has the authority to lay off federal workers, to decide how many people he needs to execute that mission. Congress has never set, this is an important point, Congress has never set an employment floor for the federal government or for departments of the government like the Department of Education. There's no floor. In other words, you don't have any minimum number of employees you have to have. So a big part of this is just shrinking that workforce down to its core minimal functions. And then working to give those funds over to states and over to communities and over to localities so they can direct how they're spent. But again, with guardrails. No money for racism, no money for men and women's sports, no money for critical race theory or illegal DEI policies. But beyond those guardrails, it's saying you can direct and control the education of your children. And then taking other functions to do with workforce development, to do with, for example, student loans, and considering whether or not those can be better administered by other departments of the federal government. And so we'll analyze and look at those programs, ensure no interruption in any way of any benefit provided to the American people, but ask whether it can be better administered elsewhere, more effective, more timely, more responsive.
The decision stems from deep concerns that the department has been overtaken by a cadre of ideologically motivated officials who, far from serving the interests of American families, have advanced agendas that many believe are divisive, radical, and antithetical to the values that shape this country. It has become a symbol, not of learning, but of centralized control, ideological conformity, and cultural engineering. What has been described as the spread of radical gender theory, critical race ideology, and mandated diversity initiatives is seen by many not as education but as indoctrination, an erosion of parental rights and an affront to the local autonomy that undergirds a healthy democratic system. The heart of this movement lies in a belief in the value of constructive dialogue, in clarity, in listening intensely to the voices of parents, communities, and students themselves. But clarity has too often been replaced by compulsion, and dialogue silenced by mandates. This isn't just a political critique, it's a psychological and philosophical reckoning. It recognizes, as any serious understanding of human nature must, that systems designed for millions must be approached with intellectual humility, a deep awareness of our limits, and a respect for complexity. Educational needs vary. Cultures vary. Children vary. And one-size-fits-all ideologies imposed from Washington risk flattening the beautiful diversity of American communities into a single narrative that doesn't reflect them. Returning control to the states and localities isn't an act of defiance against progress. It is an act of self-correction, of self-reflection, and yes, of self-critique. It embodies the freedom of inquiry and the courage to admit when a central vision has overreached. The administration, through this move, asserts that freedom of thought, speech, and belief must not be sacrificed for political orthodoxy, even one cloaked in the language of inclusion. The plan laid out involves not chaos but a reordering. It includes substantial reductions to the federal department's workforce, shrinking it to core functions, while redistributing resources directly to local schools. But these resources will come with essential guardrails: no funding for curricula or programs that promote discrimination, division, or ideologically coercive content. This isn't censorship, it's the restoration of community standards, of ethical boundaries, and of respect for taxpayers' values. Programs like student loans and workforce development will be evaluated to determine whether they can be better managed elsewhere, handled with more efficiency, responsiveness, and integrity. That process requires careful analysis, a breaking down of systems into their component parts, and a rigorous evaluation of function versus ideology. Critics may argue that this invites inequality. But this assumes a dangerous premise, that centralized control equals fairness, and that local control equals chaos. In truth, history teaches otherwise. When power is brought closer to the people, transparency improves, and accountability sharpens. Schools can respond to their community's needs with empathy and authenticity, two things no distant federal office can ever replicate. There's a deeper psychological undercurrent in all of this. It touches on the balance between order and chaos, a theme long echoed by thoughtful critics of bureaucratic overreach. Too much imposed order suffocates, too much chaos, and we disintegrate. The ideal lies in responsible decentralization, where structures provide freedom with form, not ideology enforced by fiat. This policy move also engages a deeper narrative and storytelling framework. One side tells a story of equity, inclusion, and progressive reform. The other, increasingly, tells a story of loss, of parental disempowerment, of values discarded, of traditions sneered at. Both narratives hold truths. But truth isn't found in the shouting match between them. It's found in the space where self-reflection, curiosity, and debate happen with respect. We must remember that truth-seeking is not comfortable. It brings nervousness, even fear. But it also stirs excitement, and the chance to refine our thinking. This is what real education is about, not indoctrination, but the disciplined courage to confront difficult ideas with an open mind. This move should be seen, then, not just as a confrontation, but as a learning opportunity, a moment where the nation asks, what is education for? Who decides what our children are taught? And how do we ensure that no child, no parent, and no community is silenced under the weight of enforced ideology? In many ways, this is an imaginative revisioning of educational governance. It's spontaneous, yet principled. Intangible in some ways, yes, but grounded in the tangible hopes of families who want schools that reflect their values, their stories, and their truths. The decision to dismantle the Department of Education may face legal hurdles, as anticipated. But it also sends a signal that governance must be responsive to the people. That education is not the property of bureaucrats but of communities. And that in a society rooted in freedom, ideas must compete openly, not be assigned by fiat. This is not just about policies, it's about psychological health, social trust, and the courage to speak plainly. We may not all agree on how education should look, but we must agree that it must begin with freedom. And today, the first step toward reclaiming that freedom has been taken.